History is not only written by victors, it is shaped by fear, polished by repetition, and protected by silence until distortion becomes indistinguishable from truth. And nowhere is this process more visible than in the sexual myths attached to ancient America, myths that were never properly corrected, because correcting them would have required admitting that colonization was not a civilizing mission, but a campaign of power justified through moral storytelling. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they did not arrive as curious learners, but as moral judges, armed with rigid religious doctrines, hierarchical worldviews, and the unshakable belief that virtue, discipline, and sexual order belonged exclusively to them. And any society that did not mirror European norms was instantly framed as suspicious, dangerous, or corrupt. Indigenous civilizations were not approached as complex cultures with internally consistent ethics, but as raw material for comparison, warning, and domination. And sex became the easiest tool for this distortion because sexual narratives provoke fear, fascination, and outrage more efficiently than political or economic ones. Early colonial accounts repeatedly described indigenous societies as promiscuous, incestuous, and morally uncontrolled, often without evidence, and frequently based on rumor, mistranslation, or deliberate exaggeration. And these claims were not innocent misunderstandings born of cultural difference, but strategic narratives designed to make conquest appear righteous and resistance appear sinful. If a people could be portrayed as sexually immoral, then violence against them could be framed as moral correction rather than exploitation, even though many ancient American societies had strict sexual regulations, clearly defined marriage customs, strong kinship rules, and explicit incest taboos embedded in social and spiritual law, where sex was not detached from responsibility, but integrated into systems of lineage, balance, and communal order. These realities were inconvenient for colonial agendas and therefore erased, while sensational descriptions were repeated, copied, and amplified until repetition replaced verification. One of the most enduring myths portrayed indigenous women as universally sexually available, a narrative that simultaneously dehumanized women and excused sexual violence by implying consent where none existed. Despite historical evidence showing that many communities maintained strong protections around women's autonomy, enforced consent norms, and imposed serious consequences for sexual coercion. Religion intensified these distortions as European chroniclers interpreted indigenous spiritual practices through a sexualized lens shaped by their own taboos, mischaracterizing fertility symbolism, ceremonial dances, and sacred body-centered rituals as sexual excess simply because observers lack the cultural framework to understand symbolic expression, stripping sacred meaning and replacing it with scandal. These misinterpretations were written down as authoritative observations and later cited by historians who failed to interrogate the bias, motive, or ignorance behind the original sources, allowing myth to harden into inherited fact. Accusations of incest followed a similar pattern rooted in misunderstanding rather than evidence, as indigenous kinship systems involving clan relationships, ceremonial bonds, and social roles unfamiliar to Europeans were judged through foreign definitions of family and labeled immoral instead of studied, even though most ancient American societies maintained incest prohibitions as strict or stricter than those in Europe.
These myths survived because they served power, justifying land seizure, cultural destruction, forced assimilation, and genocide by framing indigenous peoples as morally unfit to govern themselves, while correcting them would have required acknowledging that these societies were organized, ethical, and fully human, a truth that threatened the foundational narrative of colonization. Popular culture later reinforced these distortions through novels, films, and documentaries that recycled the same tropes of hypersexual natives and exotic rituals, pushing truth further into obscurity with each repetition, because sexual myths captured attention, while truth demanded patience, context, and restraint. Education systems focused on wars and dates while ignoring social structures, Museums displayed artifacts without explaining the ethical frameworks that shape daily life, and sexual narratives were left floating between fiction and assumption, rarely challenged and widely believed. Yet when indigenous scholars, archaeologists, and anthropologists reconstruct these cultures through evidence rather than ideology, a radically different picture emerges, in which sexuality was not a force of chaos, but a component of moral responsibility, neither taboo nor uncontrolled, but contextual, meaningful, and governed by social law. Acknowledging this reality forces an uncomfortable reckoning because it reveals that Europe did not hold a monopoly on morality, and that colonization was not the meeting of civilization and savagery, but the collision of power and vulnerability. Resistance to correcting these myths persists because dismantling them destabilizes long-standing historical comfort. But these myths were never truly about sex. They were about control of bodies, land, and memory, tools used to dehumanize, dominate, and erase. And until they are dismantled, ancient America will continue to be viewed through a lens shaped by fear rather than evidence, and prejudice rather than understanding. Because history does not correct itself, and people must do that. As these sexual myths settled into accepted history, they did not merely distort the past, but actively shaped how ancient America was remembered, taught, and judged. Because once a lie survives long enough, it stops feeling like propaganda and begins to feel like inherited knowledge. And this is exactly what happened when exaggerated colonial observations slowly transformed into unquestioned assumptions that defined entire civilizations. One of the most persistent myths claimed that ancient American societies embraced unrestricted sexual freedom. Yet careful examination reveals that what outsiders interpreted as permissiveness was often structured courtship, ceremonial bonding, or symbolic expression governed by social responsibility and communal oversight, where sexual relationships were tied to adulthood rights, family obligation, and moral accountability rather than impulse. In many cultures, intimacy was not a private indulgence detached from society, but a matter of public ethics, and violations of sexual norms carried consequences that were deliberately omitted from colonial records because they contradicted the narrative of chaos.
Another deeply rooted myth equated nudity with immorality, a belief entirely shaped by European shame rather than indigenous reality. Because in numerous ancient American societies, the human body was not automatically sexualized, and exposure did not imply invitation, excess, or disorder. Yet, colonial observers projected their own repression onto cultures that did not share it, transforming difference into deviance and comfort into suspicion. This projection extended into religious misunderstanding, where rituals involving fertility symbolism, bodily movement, or seasonal renewal were deliberately sexualized by missionaries and chroniclers despite a lack of evidence, because portraying spirituality as sexually dangerous made it easier to dismantle belief systems and replace them with foreign doctrine under the guise of moral reform. Myths of ritualized sexual violence emerged in the same way, often attached to ceremonies that involved performance or symbolism rather than physical acts, creating fear-driven narratives that justified intervention and suppression. Even concepts of gender were misunderstood and weaponized, as societies that recognized more than two gender roles were framed as sexually confused or morally unstable rather than socially sophisticated, despite the fact that these roles often came with clearly defined responsibilities, spiritual meaning, and ethical boundaries that challenged European assumptions. What colonial narratives consistently erased was not the absence of sexual order, but the presence of an order they refused to understand. And instead of learning that order, they labeled it chaos. Over generations, these myths were preserved not because they were accurate, but because they were useful, as they excused broken treaties, cultural erasure, residential schools, forced assimilation, and systemic violence, while absolving those in power of moral responsibility. Modern historical frameworks inherited these distortions, and even when archaeological evidence, indigenous oral histories, and scholarly research emerged to challenge them, correction was slow and often resisted because myths are easier to teach than complexity, and outrage is easier to sell than nuance. As a result, ancient American sexuality became a spectacle rather than a subject, something sensationalized in popular culture and avoided in serious education,
leaving indigenous voices marginalized in narratives about their own ancestors. Yet, when those voices are finally centered, a consistent theme emerges across regions and cultures of balance over excess, responsibility over indulgence, and community over individual impulse, revealing societies that were not defined by sexual chaos but by ethical systems rooted in harmony and continuity. The refusal to correct these myths reveals more about modern discomfort than ancient reality, because accepting the moral depth of indigenous civilizations forces a reckoning with the violence committed against them and the lies used to justify it. These myths persist not because they are true, but because they protect inherited power structures and comfortable illusions, and dismantling them requires more than academic correction. It demands moral courage and intellectual honesty. In the end, the most dangerous falsehood is not what ancient America was falsely accused of being, but the belief that history is finished, settled, and beyond question. Because history is not a closed archive, but a contested memory shaped by who is allowed to speak and who is silenced. Perhaps the real question is not why these sexual myths were created, but why they were allowed to survive for centuries without challenge, and what it reveals about societies that prefer inherited lies over difficult truths. Because the past does not ask to be defended or condemned, it asks to be understood. And the moment we stop repeating myths we did not investigate is the moment history finally stops serving power and begins, quietly but decisively, to serve truth.